Thank you all again. We're about to have a double panel now. Right after our guests here, we're going to have the CEOs of Enel and ENGIE. But first, I'd like to introduce Bill Weil, the Director of Sustainability for Facebook, and Gary Demasi, the Director of Operations, Data Centers and Location Strategy, Data Center Energy and Location Strategy for Google. Why don't I start with you, Bill?
Sure.
I was very interested when I learned that Facebook has its big data center outside the United States in northern Sweden. Why did northern Sweden make sense for you?
There are a lot of factors that go into choosing a data center. I mean, dozens, if not hundreds, of different criteria in terms of choosing a site. In the end, one of the big ones is cost. Lots of factors go into the cost. But one of the biggest factors these days, a really key criterion for us, is access to clean energy. And northern Sweden, the northern half of Sweden, is all hydropowered. We're located in Luleå, Sweden. I'm sure I pronounced that not quite right for the Swedes in the room, but doing my best. And we are right in Luleå. There's a river there. There are a number of dams on that river, and we're taking power off those dams.
And speaking of dams, there was just a question in the last panel about whether or not the reservoirs behind those dams can produce much methane. Now, certainly that may be a problem in tropical areas where you have very high amounts of biomass in the water and it may rot faster. But have you had any concerns on biomass in northern Sweden decaying at a rate that it would produce large amounts of methane?
I haven't seen any evidence in places like Sweden or temperate regions of that being an issue. I have heard of some evidence, scientific papers that have studied tropical reservoirs that have indicated that you can get quite a bit of methane in those reservoirs, especially as the water comes through the dam and gets released through the spillways, then the methane essentially bubbles out. I think that's an issue that probably deserves more study, but in places like Sweden, it doesn't seem to be an issue.
Okay. Gary, on Google, how fast is the electricity use rising for your data centers, both overall and then maybe how is it changing per processing operation? Is it becoming more efficient?
Absolutely. Our data center group, we obviously need our data centers to run all of our critical services, whether it's Gmail or Search or Google Cloud. And those services grow every year, and the number of users that we're serving grows every year. And so our data center capacity grows every year. We're growing, if you compare our total usage in 2014, which is the last time we released it, versus 2013. I don't know the exact number, but it's probably 17-18% growth in terms of electricity. It grew from 3.7 terawatts to 4.4 terawatts, and that's for all of Google. I will say that we design our data centers from the ground up. They're truly, we believe, among the most efficient data centers in the world. And we're always iterating on technology to make sure that it's as productive as possible and as efficient as possible. Between 2010 and 2015, we actually saw the computing capacity increase about 3.5 times. At the same time, the energy usage was extremely modest. The rise in energy usage was extremely modest in comparison. So we're getting about 3.5 times the amount of computing capacity we did in 2010 from the same amount of power. And I think that speaks to the degree of efficiency and the absolute commitment to efficiency that Google has.
To what extent are you able to use renewable energy for these data centers? And in places where you do not have access to renewable energy, does it tend to be gas in smaller places, Singapore or whatever, places that don't have maybe a lot of land for renewables? What kind of a ratio are you seeing? And do you have any that look as though they're running off coal-fired power?
Yeah, we're at, the last time we released figures, which was 2014, we always announce a little bit in arrears after we do the calculations, but we're at 37% renewables globally. We have 14 data center campuses around the world. One of them is under construction actually in northern Alabama. We're actually converting an old coal plant that's been decommissioned to a data center. That's a project that we're very proud of. But generally speaking, we've been carbon neutral as a company since 2007, and an absolute core component of that is sourcing as much renewable energy as possible for operations. We do that wherever we can. We've signed, as of last week when we announced another 842 megawatts of renewable energy under contract, we now have 2 gigawatts of renewable energy under contract globally for the data centers. It's not possible everywhere today, but we bring our mantra of carbon neutrality and our principles around renewable energy to whatever market we operate in around the world. You mentioned Singapore. Singapore is a very interesting market. It's a very important market to Google. We have a lot of users there who care about the quality of Google's services. And we have a data center there, a data center that's growing. Singapore right now is probably about 90% LNG produced generation. But that doesn't mean that we're not working on renewable energy solutions for Singapore. Singapore is an emerging market in terms of rooftop solar. We think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to aggregate rooftop solar for operations like data centers. The tricky part is doing it at a big enough scale that it's really going to make a difference. But we truly will bring our values around renewable energy, our commitment to that market, and over time I do expect that we'll see some success there.
You mentioned Singapore LNG. I always remember I caught a small tanker at a time when there were a lot of piracy attacks in Indonesian waters near Singapore, and I was riding on a small gasoline and diesel tanker of the sort that was tending to get attacked, coming out of Singapore and going up the Strait of Malacca towards Port Klang in Malaysia. And there was one of these very large LNG carriers coming in, and the Singaporeans provide extraordinary security for that. They had several armed vessels in the water around it. They had air cover from the Singapore Air Force. They're very, very thorough about that. Why don't I ask actually each of you about the cost of relying on renewable energy? Everybody loves to talk about how it's declining in percentage terms, but you each use renewable energy in a variety of locations, so you have sort of a location-adjusted sense of what is the cost. How much of a cost premium is it still for Facebook and for Google to use the renewable energy that you use as a rough fraction or share?
So I think actually there's been a huge change in the last couple of years in the renewable energy markets. 5 or 10 years ago, it pretty much was a premium. The costs have come down dramatically for both solar and wind. And the result is that in many locations, and also hydropower in many places is actually the cheapest energy available. So in many locations, it actually is possible to buy clean energy at a cost that is equal to or lower than the sort of average grid power. So in northern Sweden, we're paying very low premium, if any. In Iowa, same thing, where we're using wind. As part of going to Iowa, we negotiated to get a new 140 megawatt wind farm constructed. In Texas, we just started construction on a new data center there, 200 megawatt wind farm going in there. Again, little or no premium. So I think that it is possible, and increasingly possible in more places, to do it with no premium. I think the key is, and this is one of the things I think Gary mentioned, what I think we and Google and many other companies are doing, and Google really pioneered this, in fact, in the early days when I was there working with Gary, is signing long-term contracts so that the developer has the revenue certainty to allow them to go get financing, which actually allows the project to get built. And that's very different from just buying renewable energy credits or in parts of Europe, guarantees of origin, where that allows you to make the claim that you're using renewable energy, but especially when they're very cheap, which in many places they are, doesn't actually drive much difference in supply. So what we're trying to do very hard is, as we go into new places and build data centers, we want to make sure that in the process we actually make the grid greener. And I think that's something that Google's been doing. It's something that a number of other companies are doing. So I think I would say certainly there are places where you would have to pay a premium. If you sign a long-term contract, you can lock in a price for 10 or 20 years, which then insulates you from increases in grid prices. So you may pay a premium at the beginning, but you're essentially getting a hedge against future increases in prices. So I think economically for many businesses today, in most places, it makes an awful lot of business sense.
Okay. And Gary, what kind of incremental cost are you seeing?
Yeah, we look at our energy, as I said, we have a global network of data center campuses, and we really look at it as a portfolio. And every single market requires a different approach and has a little bit different cost construct. We talk about the long-term PPAs. In 2013, we actually worked with Duke Energy in North Carolina. We were announcing a pretty large $600 million expansion to our data center there. And we were able to get Duke Energy to come to the table and say, okay, we'll actually institute a renewable energy tariff for users like you and like Facebook, who's also in North Carolina. And and that is a different kind of construct, and one that's very important to Google, because as opposed to a one-off deal, sort of a one-off arrangement, which we do many of around the world because this truly requires a multi-pronged approach, that was actually an established tariff which any large industrial user could take advantage of. Because it's not just about Google and it's not just about Facebook, it's about everybody. And one of our goals is to really build a scalable solution, or help contribute to a scalable solution that's cost effective, because we're all trying to run businesses. And we wouldn't have our jobs for very long if we weren't driving really good deals for our companies. We've been successful at doing that, but it's a lot of work, and there's a heck of a lot more work to be done. And it has to be done in a financially responsible way, or companies like ours won't be able to continue to achieve the things that we need to achieve.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that, I think that it does absolutely have to be financially responsible. I think that 5 or 10 years ago, most of the companies doing this were doing it because they were concerned about climate change. But at the same time, then, okay, we really want to do this, but we need to do it in a financially responsible way because we have to run a business and we want to do it at scale. We also had bilateral conversations with Duke. I think Duke was very coy about their negotiations with you and with us, that they weren't telling us, who else they were talking to. But I think that green tariff that Duke put in place is important. One of the things that's changed in the last couple of years is now we've got a coalition of about 80 companies that, rather than each of us negotiating just one-on-one with utilities, we actually have been banding together and raising our collective voice to make clear that there are dozens, if not now hundreds, of large companies and small companies who have renewable energy goals and are going to find ways to meet them. And we'd love to work with utilities if the utilities can put green tariffs in place or other rate constructs that make it possible for us to buy green energy in a cost-effective and meaningful way that really changes the grid. And if the utilities won't work with us, then, well, if we're going to site in a place where the utility for one reason or other can't or won't work with us in that way, then we'll find a way to make it happen. But the demand for green energy from companies has exploded in the last few years. Your recent announcement was extraordinary, I thought. And I think this year we will see 2.5 or 3 gigawatts of long-term commitments by companies, long-term contracts for clean energy, which is just in orders of magnitude above where it was a couple years ago.
Okay, thank you both. We can take questions at q@nytimes.com. But first, let me open it up. First, why don't I start with the audience here? Does anybody have a question for either of our speakers before I also get questions from those who may have written into q@nytimes.com? Do I see a hand? Quiet audience. Everybody so enjoyed Tom Friedman's presentation with John Kerry. I guess why don't we go then to the email questions, please?
One of the questions in the other microphone. One of the questions I have here is, what industries should follow the lead of data centers to build their own generating capacity and become net zero? Which ones would have the hardest time? Do you want the question again?
No, that's good. Well, I think certainly I can speak directly for Facebook. I'll let Gary speak for Google. We're not building our own generating capacity today. We're not an energy company. And at least when I was at Google, that was true there. Google's done a lot of investment in projects, but in terms of our own operations, we're not building energy projects ourselves. We are signing contracts for energy and letting energy companies of one form or another build them. And I think that's something pretty much any industry can do. If you look at the coalition of companies that has made commitments around renewable energy, whether it's RE100 or the Corporate Renewable Energy Buyers Principles convened by WWF and WRI, or the Rocky Mountain Institute Business Renewables Center, there are 80 to 100 companies. They include Walmart, GM, us, Google, Microsoft, across sectors, Kaiser Permanente, IKEA. So it's retail, it's manufacturing, it's internet and data centers. So it's not industry specific. I think the key is, first you have to care. And if you care about clean energy and using that as a way to reduce your carbon footprint, then you have to actually devote staff time to figuring it out. The great thing today is I think it's easier than it was, though it's still not trivial. These contracts are not simple. The costs are lower. That makes it a lot easier. And then there's a lot of help available. There are consultants, service providers. There's the Rocky Mountain Institute Business Renewable Center, which is helping educate buyers so that they can actually do deals more easily. So I think that I would encourage any company that cares about this to look at those coalitions and find a way to get involved and to learn, and there's really no reason not to.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I talk to a lot of companies who are interested in pursuing renewable energy strategies, and one of the key things is really around scale. Scale is a great way to drive costs down. It's really hard to have a deployment of 1 or 2 wind turbines and make a big difference. And so one of the big challenges that I see is really around constructs that work for all companies across the spectrum. There are a number of small companies out there. There are a number of companies who just are under a tremendous amount of scrutiny in terms of how they resource power, and they're really looking for help. They're really looking for ideas. What constructs are available to me? Are there ways that we can aggregate load? How do I deal with term? Because these are typically long-term contracts, because that's what the developers need to get these projects financed so that they can go build another project. And so a lot of companies really need help building constructs that work for them from a business perspective. So I absolutely understand it's tough for a lot of those smaller companies. But that's also one of the challenges that our industry has. And I talked earlier about making sure that this is a scalable solution for everyone. And I think the more we do deals, the more we iterate with utilities and lock horns, frankly, with utilities a lot of the time, because this isn't necessarily
Spoken like a true negotiator.
Yes, this isn't necessarily something they want to do voluntarily all the time. And so it's companies like ours that can drive a lot of this change that hopefully pave the way for everybody on the spectrum. We talked earlier about this making sense from a cost perspective, and I really do believe it can make sense for industries across the board if we can come up with constructs that work for those particular industries.
Yeah, the one other thing I'd add to that is scale is a big issue for a lot of companies. If you're very small, you don't have that much load. You can't sign a 20-year PPA for 100 megawatts because what are you going to do with all that power? So that is a big issue, and that's one of the things that the Rocky Mountain Institute and others are trying to get companies together to try to come up with solutions. The other place where often there is an issue is if you're leasing your space and you don't actually have the contract with the utility, then the question is, your landlord may be unwilling, especially if you have a short-term lease, 3 or 5 years, they're not going to sign a 10 or 20-year power contract where then they're stuck with it when you leave. So that's something where I think we're still trying to sort out what kinds of constructs would make sense. That's an issue in the data center industry because a lot of people lease data center space.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think there are a couple different things going on in the data center industry. As more and more corporate IT moves to the cloud, users inside these data centers, corporations are demanding that the data center providers provide a solution for them. So increasingly, this will become a complex issue, not just for data center operators like Facebook and Google, but data center operators across the entire.
Yeah, and we actually saw Amazon step up starting a year ago.
Yeah.
I think in part because of pressure, I assume some internal motivation, but pressure from their data center customers saying, their cloud customers saying, we want renewable energy, and they need to figure it out.
Absolutely.
This is a large and growing area. Well, in fact, we have 2 utility executives coming up after this. One area I wanted to ask you about that might have occurred to some people. In the power sector, one of the concerns always is transmission losses. Now, AC transmission in particular, you can get rather sizable losses. In the US, transmission losses are over somewhere 7 to 10% or so of total power generated. You're putting data centers, to some extent, a long way from population centers. I don't want to offend any Swedes here by saying the middle of nowhere, but northern Sweden is not known for having...
It is a beautiful place.
Not known for having a lot of people. So, and yet with the optical fibers, I would imagine that your transmission losses in terms of the costs of having those repeaters every 50 or 100 miles probably aren't that high. But what are the transmission loss costs associated with having only a handful of data centers that may be serving people on their computers and mobile phones up to 10,000 miles away if you're Sweden versus India?
I think for a lot of internet companies, if you're running a service where the user experience depends in part on the latency, the response time. You type a query into Google, how fast you get the response. Google has made a a real point of trying to make that as fast as possible. For Facebook, you bring up your Facebook page, you're looking at your news feed. If that is slow to load, then you're not going to be very happy. And the farther away the data center is in network terms, so it could be down the street, but if your network route goes halfway around the world, then that's going to be very slow. That's important. So the user experience is really the big driving factor there. At the same time, we can't put data centers in every city around the world because we can't afford that much capacity. So we're growing as our service grows. We add data centers over time. Just as Gary mentioned earlier, Google has done the same as they grow. The energy cost of those repeaters on the fiber optics is very, very low. So I think the real issue there is simply the main thing is the business issue of what's the latency.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I hate to cut you off, but I suspect that
Just one
the
more
transmission losses on those repeaters are small. Would you agree?
I was just going to say that the energy actually saved, I agree, it's small, but I want to point out that the energy saved through the use of our services. We have lots of statistics out there. These things might be far away, but they're using things like Gmail, and they're using things like Google Maps, and they're using all of these services which actually contribute to people saving energy and reducing carbon footprint. So there are different trade-offs.
Okay. Thank you, Bill and
Right,
Gary.
thank you, Keith.
Thank you very
Appreciate
much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Please, or here, you have a seat next to me. Well, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For our next panel, I'd like to welcome Francesco Starace, who is the CEO and General Manager of Enel of Italy, a company that has been very active in installing digital meters in Italy and around the world. And also Gérard Mestrallet, he is the Chairman and CEO of ENGIE, with electricity operations in 17 countries, including a big effort in digitalization as well. Why don't I start with digitalization? There was recently an item in the news, in fact, Al Gore was citing it a couple of days ago, it was a New York Times article, on how in Texas, in part of Texas, they are now providing free electricity after 9 p.m. to try to get people to use the wind energy at night. Now that's partly just because they have so much wind, but it also is a bit of a brute force approach to trying to manage demand because they don't have a lot of smart meters. Now, Mr. Starace, you have more than 30 million smart meters in Italy. Why have you made such an investment in them, and how does that affect energy use and the efficiency of energy use?
Well, the reason why we started...
We have a, here, let's get you a handheld mic. Sometimes that's more reliable. Here we go.
The reason
There we go. I think it's on now.
It always takes a little time.
Takes a little time.
The reason why we did invest so much in digital meters in Italy is that at that time, and we're talking about 15 years ago, there was an idea that there would be convergence on the single customer by an array of utilities. So there would be telecoms, water, gas, electricity, all into the home, and a meter to take care of that. Now that didn't happen 15 years ago. The meters actually did save us a lot of money. This was an investment of 2.5 billion euros at that time. It took us 4 years to put meters everywhere. They were paid back in about 3 years in terms of savings in the readings and the fraud, tampering of the meters, in the remote operation of the meters. And that was it, okay? As Italy progressed in installing quite a lot of distributed generation across the country at medium and low voltage level, the meters became an integral part of what we have today, which is a fully digitized distribution network, which did what the Texas system doesn't do today, so manage the loads and manage the flow of energy across different regions in a very efficient manner. It is today a smart system that manages energy flows and directions and directs the energy in ways that were not thought of when the grid was laid down years and years ago. So it's been let's say, the reason was wrong, the result was great. And today we're changing these meters with second generation meters.
Mr. Mestrallet, maybe I'd put the same question to you in terms of how you're advancing digitalization, particularly, I guess, France on December 1, just last week, began stepping up its investments in smart meters as well. How have you used digitalization to try to manage and improve the efficiency of energy in your operations as well? Maybe your mic will work, I hope so. Let's see.
Perhaps it works, yes, it's
Good.
working. Well, it's absolutely obvious that the energy sector is facing now a double revolution, digital revolutions and technological revolution with the technologies of power production. After 60 years during which nothing happened, or quite nothing in the energy technology. And so the digitalization is flowing over the sector like in any other sectors. And that's true that in energy efficiency, the digitalization is absolutely key. Our group is at the same time power and gas producer, but we have 50,000 people in the sector, but 100,000 people totally dedicated to energy efficiency, and we consider that we are in that sector the world leader in energy efficiency. And of course, digitalization, by the capacity we have to put sensors everywhere in our customers' plants, homes, in the customers' offices, we can have the immediate consumption in order to adjust the temperature when there are people in the room. We can also optimize completely the consumption of power for our industrial customers, for the cities. The cities today want absolutely to reduce their carbon footprint and energy consumption. And the digitalization allows us to have on time, online, the totality of the informations available, and also with the software that we built, we have the capacity to optimize their consumption. That's the case for big industrial groups, which are our customers, for the large office centers. Our customers have the biggest towers in the world, such as the Shard in London or the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. We optimize their energy consumption. But also individuals. We have an agreement with Google Nest by offering to our customers at the same time energy and a thermostat, a smart thermostat in order to reduce the consumption. That's paradoxical, but nevertheless, we offer on the one hand energy, supply energy, and on the second hand, the means to reduce the consumption.
Mr. Mestrallet, why don't I stay with you on a question on district heating. Now, China had a sad, although perhaps almost amusing experience on district heating a few years ago. There was a rule that came down from Beijing that cities needed to reduce their carbon emissions, and in particular that they needed to close coal-fired power plants. And one city in northern China made a point even in inviting in the television stations and the local media and dynamited the cooling tower of the coal-fired power plant. It collapsed in ruins, and the state media even promoted, we have shut down this particular one as a symbol 2 weeks before the year-end deadline. A few hours later, it got very, very cold at the city's hospital and the city hall. And they realized that that coal-fired power plant had been providing the heat for the hospital, which had to be evacuated because it was literally froze that night, ice on the windows and so forth. I know you would never do that, but how is district heating progressing for you? To what extent are you able to use more of the, what previously was almost waste heat from some of your operations?
No, that's an important question because it concerns, in fact, district cooling and district heating at the same time. Because heat represents around 40% of the energy consumption, when electricity is only 20%. So it's 2 times more important in terms of energy consumption than electricity. And it's true that today we cannot use solar power or wind power for heating. Nevertheless, the progressive and growing use of renewables source of energy for district heating and district cooling is more and more possible. We can use biomass and we can use geothermal. That's already the case. For example, in Paris, more than 50% of the energy used for the Paris district heating that we manage, it comes from renewable sources. Biomass, and the biomass can come from wood, pellets, can come from urban waste, which is transformed into heat, and from geothermal. You know, geothermal is a growing source of heat. We can use more and more because of the progress, the technological progress made by heat pumps. We can use more and more the heat of the underground to heat buildings. And in Paris, we are going at minus 1,000 meters to have hot water and use it in the heating network. For the cooling network, it's also a growing product. And you mentioned China. I happen to be at the same time an advisor to the mayor of Beijing, Shanghai, and Chongqing. And they have the same objective to reduce the air pollution and therefore to reduce the use of coal plants. And in Beijing, they have decided already to reduce to zero the production of coal, use of coal. And therefore, the cooling network use the fresh water of the Yangtze River.
Yes.
And this is a technique that we use also in Paris. In Paris here, I don't know if this building for its air conditioning is using our cooling network, but we have underground 5 cooling plants in Paris, one close to the Grand Palais, that you don't see because it's very deep in the underground, using the fresh water of the River Seine as an exchanger. So we no longer exchange heat with the air, but with the water. That's the case already today in Chongqing with the Yangtze River. That's the case also we have in Marseille, and we use the water of the sea for the air conditioning. And that's so we can use more and more renewable sources of energy for the district heating and district cooling.
It's interesting that you mentioned China. I was in Xi'an a few years ago on a story, and I went to their geothermal operation. They had a challenge. The problem of China is that the rocks underground, under pretty much all of China, are not hot enough for geothermal electricity generation because they are not close enough to the boiling point to boil and turn a turbine, and even using coal to heat it above the boiling point doesn't really make economic sense. But they were heating something like 10 million square feet of buildings with this 80-degree centigrade supply of water from deep underground that they were pumping up. So it was a use of geothermal. Why don't we talk instead about distributed power and whether it is a threat or an opportunity for utilities? For me, what first brought home perhaps both a threat and opportunity was when I was in a village in Bihar state in northeastern India a few years ago. Bihar has gotten better now, but at the time it was in terrible shape. They had a couple of coal-fired power plants, both of which had to be shut down because they could not pay for new parts for them, and yet at the same time there was a political impasse on being able to raise electricity prices, plus also they had widespread theft of electricity. So I went to this village that had lost any form of grid electricity, and I've slept in a thatch simple structure on the ground and all that. And yet they had a little bit of electricity. Why? Because somebody whose family was originally from that village had donated solar-powered battery lights. And everybody was reading and all and still able to do their studies after dark. So it showed that you could manage without any, in this case, practically any grid electricity in the whole state. I mean, I guess the capital was buying electricity from the neighboring state of West Bengal. So as the technology of solar has become much more widely available since then, is that a threat to you, a loss of market, or is that an opportunity? Why don't I start with you, Mr. Starace?
Well, it depends very much on what is it that you want to do. You know, if you want to remain a pure producer of energy, then of course it is a threat to you because it subtracts demand, it displaces you from reaching customers. So I think companies that think of themselves and act as if they are only a power producer really have a problem with this. If you look at yourself as a power provider, that is a grid basically, then you have to consider that many of the installations, at least in all the OECD countries that are now coming up in hundreds of thousands, are indeed working two ways. They are working producing and they're working absorbing energy during, for example, night hours. So what you need to provide is a stable system that is able to absorb, move around, and give back energy at the right time of the day, at the right moment. And that is a big job. It's a very complex one, and it's a very delicate infrastructure, the one that you have to set up and run. So there's a lot of value into that. I don't think there is a threat if you take that as a fact that distributed generation is going to be normal. It is already normal. For example, in many countries like Italy, we have 600,000 small installations totaling more than 12,000 megawatts. And the system works back and forth. There are parts of Italy where energy is produced at low voltage and flows upwards rather than going the other way around when it was designed. And that's because the system is sensing the way energy flows. So in itself, it can be a threat. Like I said, if you just think of yourself as a generator, if you think of yourself as a provider of energy, not just generating it, it can become a fantastic opportunity. And there are many things that technology can give us going forward if you look at what a grid can offer to a system that keeps evolving in a digital sphere. Think about batteries, think about electric cars, think about cars that charge and discharge. Yesterday we announced a partnership with Nissan here in France to test on real scale charging vehicles. That's done, discharging them and using the battery sitting in the car all the times. There are many things that a good operator can do, and we shouldn't be at all scared of distributed generation. It is going to be part of the generating assets of most countries going forward.
Mr. Mestrallet, would you agree? Is it an opportunity, or would you worry? Do you see yourself as a distributor, not just certainly a generator?
It's absolutely clear that our role, the role of companies like ours, by the way, we are no longer a utility, we are international energy groups. Our role is changing. And for ENGIE, we consider that we are no longer simply an energy supplier, but we are, and we want to become the energy partner of our customers. Energy partner, energy architect of this energy transition. Because it's obvious that we are shifting completely from the old system, the old energy world made of bigger and bigger power plants, stronger and stronger high voltage lines, is shifting to a new world of energy, more decentralized with smaller and smaller units. And the size between a big power plant and a solar panel has been divided by 1 million. That's a complete revolution. Decentralized, decarbonized, we're in the COP21, and digitalized with transversally energy efficiency. And so our role is completely changing. And we've decided 2 years ago, our company, to symbolize this transformation by changing our strategic objective. Now we want to be the leader of the energy transition, first in Europe, and the energy benchmark outside Europe, because we produce 2 times more power outside Europe than in Europe. And to illustrate that, we have decided to impair massively the old world, right? 15 billion of impairment on the old world, power plants, coal plants, even gas-fired power plants. And so what does that mean for us? It means that more renewables, already today, more than 60% of our projects under construction are renewables, and we mean wind, solar, concentrated solar, geothermal, biomass, and hydro. We mean energy efficiency, which is a people-intensive business, using lots of digital, and we mean also all the new products linked with the digital, smart grids, energy storage,
Right.
and all the new technologies.
Thank you. Why don't I open it up for a question here before we run out of time? Maybe do I see a hand for either Mr. Starace or Mr. Mestrallet? Okay, if I don't get a question from the audience, then I may turn to some of the questions we've been getting as a steady flow to q@nytimes.com, which is how people can also write in with their questions if they don't choose to raise their hands right here in this particular room. Please, let's get one. If you please read one of the questions that were emailed in.
Okay. In what ways do you consider that the regulatory environment for your companies needs to change?
There's a broad one.
Let me
1 minute apiece.
There's many ways, but basically, I think first of all, and I'm not saying this because I'm trying to be nice to the regulators. It's a classic of this industry to criticize the regulators. They have a very hard work nowadays because they are always late in whatever happens. Of course, they must be late in the fact that things happen and they have to rule on them. They cannot rule ahead, which is, I think, at least what we can agree to. What we would like the regulators to only not do is regulate backwards. So they can change the rules. They should change the rules. And I'm not saying that rules need to be there all the time, but they cannot be changed retroactively. So what is right today should stay. Tomorrow you can change it, but from tomorrow, not back for today. That's the only thing I would like regulators to do. They can change, they keep changing, they need to keep track of what's going on, but please don't come back in time, because time travel is not allowed also for regulators.
1 minute exactly. You're an experienced speaker at these conferences. 1 minute, Mr. Mestrallet, the same question.
Yes, I will go further. Of course, to regulate back should be simply forbidden everywhere. But what we would like also would be stable, visible, and predictable regulation for the future. We prefer tough rules of the game rather than changing rules. When we cannot know what will be the future rules of the game in our sector, it is a sector where highly capital intensive. And when we invest in a production capacity, it is at least for 20 years and sometimes for 50 or even more when it is a hydro project. And so the stability of the regulation, the visibility of the regulation, it can be adapted, but not completely transformed and changed. And so we need visibility for the future. And what we are asking today, and we are asking together through the migrate group that we have created in Europe, is visibility and predictability of the regulatory rules.
Thank you both, Mr. Starace, Mr. Mestrallet. We've now had 4 big companies talking about what they are trying to do on sustainability issues. With that, I'd like to give you over to Tom Friedman, the New York Times Foreign Affairs op-ed columnist, and we're going to get maybe more of the policy solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, this way. Thank you.